Hello, in this video we're going to take a look at the Workload Identity Federation preview feature of Azure AD. We'll discuss how to set it up with an external identity provider. You can read more about the benefits of this feature and how it works, but we'll go through the steps so that it's easier to see how basically to configure the external identity provider, and we'll try a couple or even 3 of them maybe, and then we'll look at how to this token exchange works. So step number 1 to understand is basically in the documentation we provide in the how it works description, and you can see that there are multiple steps. One of the steps is establishing this trust relationship between the app registration and the external identity provider. And what will happen is the workload that's running somewhere else will request a token from its known identity provider, and then that identity provider will give it a token. The application will take this token and set it to Azure Active Directory to exchange that token for an Azure AD token. The Azure AD will check the trust relationship using special configuration that we discuss in the trust relationship setup, and will return the token to the external workload, and the workload will be able to use this token to access things as if it got the token directly from Azure AD. So the benefit here is this external workload will not need to store credentials for the application inside of an Azure AD. Okay, so let's begin taking a look at how it works. So we will focus out of the supported scenarios in this quick video on this one because it's the most open-ended one since it uses any external IdP. So what we will do first, we will need to configure a trust relationship between Azure AD and that IdP. So this document describes how to do that using REST API calls to the Graph API, but the portal also supports some of the same capabilities. So we'll do it in the portal for easier to follow. So what I will do is I'll open a portal right now, and here I'm logged in into my Azure Active Directory tenant. And I will create an application. This will be the application that will be used for setting up access control within Azure, for example. So I'll create an application. We'll call it AV Workload Identity 1. We'll make it single tenant. That's step number 1. We just created an application. And then for that application, we will be able to go to here, and using the federated credentials tab, create our credentials. So let's take a look at what's possible. So when we say add a credential, it says, do you want to use one of these canned ones out of the box or an open issue, other issue? And here we'll need to fill out some information. We will need to fill out 2 main things, the issuer and a subject identifier, and we'll discuss those. And we'll also need to fill out a name and an audience tag for that credential. Okay, so, and again, this is for OpenID Connect identity provider. So whatever this issuer here is, that's what it needs to be. So let's take a look at the following. So let's talk about what this issuer means, what the subject identifier means, and what the audience means, okay? So let's say I pretend to have a JWT token compliant with OpenID Connect with the issuer claim, the audience, the subject, right? And the expiration dates, etc. So what if we just take these claims, generate a JWT token, and test out the flow without creating any external connectors, just to see what errors we get to understand what things are being checked. So if I go to something like a token.dev, I can take my token and I can basically post it here and tell it to generate for me a JWT string, right? So if I take this string now, it's expired. So we will change the expiration date so it's not expired. And basically this JWT string, if you post it in another tool like JWTMS, you can see it decodes it, and these are the claims, okay? So now let's take a look at the docs again and say, okay, let's pretend we already set up, which we didn't yet, the trust relationship. How would I get the token, right? How would I get the token? So I would get the token by making this basically just the describing of how to get tokens for different flows. And inside of the access token with a certificate or access token with a federated credential. So the key part to understand here is we will make a call to the regular token issuing endpoint v2, and we will tell it that we are giving it a JWT bearer token through this assertion type. And inside of this assertion, we will put the JWT token itself. So I have created a little Postman collection to help us with these steps. And we basically are going to try this call right here, right? So this call right here will be pointing to the Active Directory. This is my tenant ID. This is that endpoint. And we will try to make a call exactly how the documentation says. Grant client credential. We'll put our application ID right here. This is the assertion type. This is the scope for which we want the credential, and this is actually going to be that JWT token. So let's do these steps. So step one, we need to go to our application that we just created, the client ID, and grab its client ID. So this is the client ID, and this is the tenant. This is the tenant. So in here, the tenant is already set. The client ID is not yet set, so we'll connect. And right now, let's remove everything that's here. Okay, and let's make a post call and see what happens, what the error message we get. So basically it says, hey, the client assertion was not provided. Okay, obviously it's empty, it needs to be provided. So let's go to our sample JWT token that we generated here, which is completely fake, right? It's pointing to some issuer, it's pointing to some audience and some subject, and it doesn't have much other information, and it doesn't have a signature obviously as well, except something that was generated here, and it's even signed with the wrong, potentially wrong algorithm. So let's see what happens if we make a call using this value. So we can see that first validation error that we get is that, hey, the token must have a lifetime of less than 1 day, and our token was too long. So let's shorten its time. So I just generated the 2 tokens issued 3 minutes ago, expires in 15 minutes. So maybe let's give it a little longer time. Okay, so now this is the token that is not expired yet. Let's give Postman a call. So this error will probably change now. Okay, and it's saying, hey, I could not find a matching record for the presented assertion, and see it parsed out the token that we were using. Right here you can see account ABC, subject value 1, audience value that, right? So these are the things that it's looking, and it's not finding any application that has these values defined. So why don't we go and define those on an app, even though it's completely fake, right? So let's go to our application and create the federated credential. So we're going to say other issuer, and we're going to fill in the value. So for the issuer, let's match it to the accounts.abc, not a real issuer. For the subject claim, we're going to put subject value 1 to match kind of our token. That's representing the user within that issuer in essence. Then here we're going to put federated credential 1. And then for the audience, let's for now put in this value just to see what happens. And we'll say add. So we added this under our application. There's a little bit of caching going on. So it's possible when we make the call, it may not still be available there, but let's see. Okay, so it did find it because the error message changed, and it says, hey, invalid token, the assertion is signed with an unsupported algorithm. And it says that allowed algorithm, the error message says is RSA256. When we generated our fake token using this debugger, we specifically used a different one. So let's regenerate it. So we just changed the algorithm, keeping everything the same. Now let's double check that this is actually different, right? So it's the same token, same value, same everything. And now let's do a post call using this token again. And we see, hey, request to the external OIDC endpoint failed. obviously what is happening is because our token is completely fake, this endpoint right here is not a real OpenID Connect provider endpoint. So it's failing to find the well-known metadata, and it's failing at that point. So you can kind of see how all of these validation steps are going. We did not expect this to work, but the idea was just to see, to understand how you can debug the error messages that come back from requests that have invalid tokens. So next, we will try to use in Azure Active Directory another tenant and see how that works. So instead of using completely fake token that we just generated in a text file, that obviously is not a real token, we'll ignore that. And what I have is I have another tenant in Azure Active Directory. And inside of that tenant, I created myself an app. So you can see it's a different tenant than the one that's opened here. You can see that difference. This is the DD tenant, and this is 2.8. And what we have there is an application with a secret. So we are going to get a real token now, okay, from Azure Active Directory. So this is this AAD token. We're going to make a request to the Active Directory where the app is, with the right secret, and we'll put in the right credentials, and we'll do a send request. And we got a token back, expected because it's valid parameters. So this is the external identity provider in this case, ADP. Let's see what this token looks like. We'll need it for later. You can see the issuer is that tenant where I got the token from, and you can see my subject is a GUID of the application inside of that tenant. So it's 7 something something. It's the service principal corresponding to this thing. So the way to compare it, just so that it's not confusing, is under enterprise applications. It's this ID right here is the object ID we can see inside of the token claim, tenant ID, etc. So what happens if we take this token now and try again to exchange it, okay? What will happen is it will error out because this token again doesn't match any federated credentials. So it says no matching identity found. Great, let's go and fix it up, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to come to our application and fix this credential, right? So let's replace this value with the right issuer. So this is what the issuer claim will be. We'll put it there. So this is the issuer claim. Let's put in the subject, which will be the application service principal object ID. And then for the audience, let's match the audience to what is being given here. We'll make the audience match that. So that's the audience. Okay, so now again, let's see if the caching works. So if we try it right now, it will probably still be previous value for a few seconds. Okay, perfect. The cache was not there. And we can see right away, we get an error message. AD issue tokens may not be used for a federated identity flows. Okay, great. So that means we couldn't try a fake token, which makes sense. And we could not try an AD issue token from another tenant because there is, a rule that says that AD issue tokens cannot be used for federated identity flows. I discovered this when I was trying to learn how this federated identity, external identity works. And I was hoping I can just use AD, and I hit this problem. So we'll next look at how to use another real IDP to actually test it end-to-end. So to simulate a real IDP external one and see this token exchange happening, I'm going to use my Auth0 free account, and I'll come in here and I will create an API in Auth0 and the corresponding application that will be my IDP. So let's just try this out. So this will be AV Workload Identity 1. Just, it doesn't have to be the same name as my application endpoint. This is the identifier. And the identifier, let's actually match it to what our documentation says is the right way. So it will, let's use this identifier for our application. So the audience claim matches what is preferred. So that will be And this is the signing algorithm. We already saw that that's required. So we'll create the API. And the API, nicely for us, created automatically the test application. So if I go to this API and I click on the API, you can see this is the token issuing parameters. All of this is Auth0 stuff, so it's not really relevant for what I want to show. But under the test, because we have an application now, we can use this little bit of curl code to actually get a token, right? And we'll take a look at this curl code right now. Okay, so copy the curl command that it gave me. This is the endpoint that Auth0 is telling me to call. And this is the payload to get my token. This is the client ID of the application that just created for me, the secret of that application, the audience we set for the API, and client credential grant, right? So just regular auth token issuing call. I'm just going to run it from Cloud Shell because it has curl already. And boom, I get back the response. It looks a little hard to read, but there is the access token right here, right? So let's just feed this into JQ. You can see it a little bit easier. So there is the JSON that came back from Auth0. This is the token that it gave me, okay? Let's take this token and go and take a look inside. So the token is right here. We will need to soon use these values, these three values, to configure our federated credential. But let's not do it yet. Let's just first try it. So if I come back to the Postman and say, hey, Azure Active Directory, for my application, do this token exchange for me, please. It's going to fail and say, like, look, I don't know anything about this issuer, this audience, and this claim. And again, where they are coming from, they are from inside of the token. So let's go fix up our application to have those things set up. So we go to the application that we have been using. We go to this federated credential. It's kind of nice that I can edit it live without having to recreate it. So let's set up the issuer correctly. So that's the issuer endpoint. Okay. Then we need to set up the subject properly. Again, the subject is representing the principal to which this token was given, and it needs to be, this combination needs to be unique for this application. Our documentation explains it, so it can match when you're making a request to exchange a token. It needs to find exactly the application for which to do it for. So let's see what we have. So this is the ID that is inside of there, the subject claim. So we'll set that subject claim inside of our credential. And then we also need to set the audience properly, and the audience is going to be what we gave when we created this API in Auth0. So now we update it. Okay, so let's take a look at Auth0 just for a second. Why is it giving these credentials? Because if I look at the application that it created for my testing there, you can see this is that client ID, and this client ID is right here. Their convention is to add the word that clients there. This is the token issuing endpoint, and this is the API that I set up right here, right? So that's the API. So now this token exchange should work. And we got a successful response from Azure Active Directory giving us an access token valid for 1 hour. And let's look inside of that token. What are we going to see there? Well, we're going to see a regular token issued to the audience we requested. We requested it to be for managing Azure. So it's managementazure.com, basically for accessing roles-based access control, protected resources. It was issued to by my tenant in Active Directory for 1 hour. And then what are these things? This is the application 8BA. What is that? This is the application client ID to which this token was provided. And then we also see the object ID, the tenant ID, and the subject. So you can see 6CF5. This is going to be the enterprise application. (6C85). That's that. This is the token given for this application. And now if I have a subscription and I give permission, let's say inside of this subscription, if I give a permission right here, add role assignment, and I give it a reader role, I can give this to the service principal in question, AV workload identity, and later we'll see if it actually works. So we basically assign the permission now. So this token was given to us by Azure AD by exchanging the Auth0 token. So that's one example. Let's also take a look just to see how it would look from another identity provider, just to see the comparison. So as a second example, we looked at Auth0 before. Let's look at an IDP that is from Google. And I basically went to Google. I created a desktop application. So just to show you what I configured it like, I gave it a name. It gave me a client ID and client secret. Okay. And this is kind of my application in Google. And what I will do with that application is I will get an authorization code, right? So this is the way, right, for Google token issuing endpoint, there is no client credential grant directly that I could find. So I will do a regular authorization code flow. I'll take the client ID of my application, put it here, response type code. I want the OpenID credential, access offline, so it gives me a refresh token, and then this redirect. So I will open this up in the browser, okay? And then Google will take me to log in to this thing. So Google is saying, hey, log in into this account now. I'll log in into this account, and it gave me this code, right? So it gave me this code. And then I will take this code and I will do the second call of the auth exchange. I'll exchange this using Google's endpoint here, basically same client, my secret, and then this is the old code. So let's see how the old code works. Bad request, it's not valid anymore. These codes expire very quickly. So I'll do an exchange. Boom. Google came back with a token that's valid for an hour, and it gave me the access token, and it also gave me the ID token. This is not, right? This token is not JWT token, so it could not use it for an exchange with a federated identity, but this is the OpenID Connect token, so it is the one that we will want to use. So I took that token and I posted it into this decoder tool. Perfect. It's using the RSA 256 protocol, and it basically has an issuer, audience, and subject. The subject is the ID of the account I used, and the audience is the client credential, right? So this is the client credential under which the flow went through. Okay, so we'll close that. And then if we take the same token and try to do an exchange of that token over here, it will fail, right? It will fail. It will fail because it will not find it. It says again, hey, I can read the claims from inside of it, but I cannot find anything on this application that matches this this token. So let's go fix that and see if it works. So instead of updating the previous credential, we will add another one to the same application. So app registration, workload identity, certificates, federated, add. Let's add this one and say this one is going to be Google. And we are going to put here see, I could not control the audience, so I could not set the audience to be the preferred value, this one. So I'm going to use whatever it is giving me the audience, basically the user itself, the client, the application itself. Subject is going to be this ID of the user for which this token was provided. And the issuer will be this thing, accounts.google.com. And just to show that accounts.google.com or any OpenID provider will have this well-known endpoint where all of the public keys and other things are visible and token issuing, and this is basically where the certs are that it's using to verify, right? That's how Azure Active Directory knows to do this verification. Is this token valid or not being provided to me, right? But we don't need to worry about it because if we just put this endpoint as the issuer, it's a well-known endpoint that gets appended to it when it needs to check whatever it needs to check. So this is Google. Let's actually rename this one. I can't rename it, so it's fine. So that's Google. So now this call failed before because it could not determine. Let's see if this works. Boom, it worked this time because we added the mapping to say that if you get a token from this external IDP, exchange it for this one, or issue me mine. And now if I look in this one, it's now coming in from my application. So now let's try to actually use the token we got to see if we can list Azure resources. So I just will construct a call to the management endpoint for my subscription, for resource groups. Hopefully the API version is correct that I have, and we will provide the authorization. Here will be the token we just received, right? So let's go and take a look at that. So we got this token right here. We'll post it in here, so it provides it as a bearer token. We do a send, and successful response comes back to us listing the resource groups in the subscription, and it's working. And how did we get this token? We got this token by going and using a Google credential in essence. So I got the token from Google and exchanged it through that federated credential, and I got back a token for the management Azure scope in Azure, and this is the token I received back. So obviously inside of this token, there's no more information about the original issuer, but it is known who it is because this token was given to this application, and this application is the one that is making this call because we gave it permissions. If you remember, we gave it permissions here through the workload identity right there. Okay, so that's kind of how it works. Final thing that may be interesting to check is what happens if the token is signed with a valid endpoint here, but not the valid signature, because that maybe during your debugging you may encounter this type of a problem. So let's kind of simulate this failure mode, right? So this is going to be token we get from real place. So let's just decode it real quick. So we're going to decode it, and we got the issuer, the subject, and all of these nice claims. We're going to come here. I'm going to replace this with that, right? But obviously it's not signed correctly because this is just a tool that I'm using to generate the token. So if I put it here, it's signed with something, but it's not signed with the well-known endpoint of Google. I can't. This tool signs it with its own private key. Okay, so what will happen now if I try to take that token that I just had and make the client assertion request for the federated identity? What error will we see? This is the type of error you may see if your OIDC IdP is not issuing, that does have some issues with the keys or other things. See what it says: client assertion contains an invalid signature. Does not match the provided signature. It found some keys, right? Because it was pointing to the right well-known endpoint, but whatever the signature was not right, so it's failing, right? So this is how you may see this error. Then you need to check that your keys are correct and all of that your IDP is actually working properly. But as we saw in this example, when using the right IDP, right? So if we try Google again, it will fail because it's expired already endpoint. But if we do it with a new token from Auth0, they're both kind of should work. So I'll grab this token, just go straight into the client assertion, submit it to this exchange. It will succeed because both of them are attached to the same application. And then I can use this credential to list resource groups. So hopefully this was interesting, and helpful to kind of understand the flow of how it works. This diagram is amazing at explaining it, but we went through actually trying it with a few different IDPs and seeing some of the errors that you can expect, etc. Again, the built-in capabilities for example, um, GitHub Actions. There's a document that describes how to do that. So this document describes step by step how to set up with GitHub Actions, and this document will explain how to do the testing with Google Cloud using different types of accounts. What I showed you just now was more of a user account in Google. This shows how to do it with the service principal, but the idea is similar. So this is, the endpoint that exchange that gets the tokens back, and these tokens are then exchanged using Azure Active Directory. So hopefully, again, this was helpful. Thank you very much for watching. Please leave comments below, questions on Twitter. Thanks. Bye.